in this Epiphany season, which is intended to help us understand who Jesus is. We began with the story of the Magi bringing the gifts, then the story of the baptism of Jesus, followed by the call of the disciples. And last week we heard the story of the beginning of Jesus' ministry according to Mark, with preaching in the synagogue at Capernaum and healing the demon-possessed man. This week we continue to follow the story of Jesus' ministry as he moved from the synagogue into Simon's house. I read a reflection by a pastor named Delmer Chilton, who said that years ago a youth group gave him a t-shirt that he wore so often he wore it out. It read, "To be is to do, Socrates. To do is to be, Plato. Doobie-doobie-doo, Sinatra." Our gospel lesson for today shows us that moving back and forth between doing and being. Healing Simon's mother-in-law and the others who were brought to him, doing, getting up early and going off to pray, just to be with God. In the midst of his prayer time, the disciples interrupt him with demands that he come and do what everyone wants him to do, more healing. Instead, he insists on going to the next city to preach because, quote Mark 1:38, "That is what I came out to do." As with Jesus, so with us. For the church and as individual believers, it is sometimes difficult to find a balance in the doing and the being. We can get busy with our ministries, our programs, and keeping the organization running and meeting the needs as we seek to serve others without taking the time for God or ourselves. The usual end result of that is those who are doing too much get resentful of those who they think are not doing enough. On the other hand, there are those who are really good at being with God, but have a hard time figuring out ways to be involved with caring for God's people. Reverend Chilton said he counts himself among those groups. He grew up on a farm in the South, and his father used to say that Delmer was a really hard worker if you told him what to do. But if you just told him to go do something, he'd stand there and think it to death. He goes on to say that sometimes we think our religion to death. We spend so much thinking it through that we have trouble getting active in love. I think more of us struggle, as I do, with being task-oriented and being focused on the doing. That's why it's so important to take the time, as we do every week on this Lord's Day, to gather for worship. And that's why it is so vital that we spend time in relationship with God in prayer. This story has within it the doing of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law and the being of Jesus going off to pray alone. And whenever we come across a healing story, I always feel caught up in a question, a quandary that I have accepted is never going to be answered. And that is, why is it that God's healing seems to flow beautifully, sometimes even miraculously, in the lives of some, and for others, it doesn't? That mystery is something that I am not going to understand this side of glory. But I do know that God works in amazing and sometimes even miraculous ways to bring healing. And I am, not the person appointed to discern which is when. And that's why it is so important to also have that life rooted in just being with God. Because it is in the being, it is in the prayer, it is in the worship, it is in the times of connecting with God that we are able to learn to trust our whole lives and the lives of those that we love into God's tender mercies, so that regardless of what the future holds, we are able to trust that God is in it and carries us forward. And so as we think about what it is to deal with the life of faith in the ways that God would have us to do, it's a balance of doing and of being. I have said many times before that the cross is a wonderful reminder of this truth, that the vertical part of the cross reminds us that we are to be rooted and grounded in our relationship with God and Jesus Christ, and that the horizontal part of the cross points us out into the world to love God and neighbor. Jesus is going out to pray after he has had practically the whole town come and show up for this healing. And they want more of that. That is what they are searching for from him. And it's, Jesus knows that he needs time to regroup, to recharge, to refocus on what it is that God is calling him to do. And the temptation to stay and to just keep healing is similar to the temptation that Jesus has already come through in the 40 days in the wilderness. The temptation to become so enamored with the power that he has been given as to lose sight of the call that God has placed upon his life. And so once he goes off to pray and to be in God's presence, he understands that the call is not only to healing, but most importantly, to going and to sharing the word. And that is what he says to the disciples when they come and, tap on his door. I always think of being a parent with small children with this story where you can barely even go to the bathroom by yourself, right? You have people chasing after you. So the disciples are chasing after him, and he says, no, we're not going back there to heal. We're going on to preach in the next place. It is this balance that is so important for a life of faith that continues to be active and vital. That's why every year I go on silent retreat, and I'm getting ready to go again the week of February 19th, because I really need that time to be settled, to be open, to listen for what God would speak into my heart, to spend time in prayer for our community. And my favorite image of what God does in such times of simply being in God's presence is the image of a jar of river water. You know how if you take a glass jar and scoop water out of any river, you're going to end up with water that's swirling and full of all sorts of particulate, right? But then what happens when you set that jar down? If you set that jar down, all of the sediment, all of the murkiness will settle to the bottom, and you will have that clear water again, right? So it is with our spirits in prayer. We need time to settle. We need time to be present to God so that God can sort out and clarify and call us and claim us again and again. And so as we come this morning to the table, I invite you to do so in a spirit of one who seeks to be with God. Allow it to be a time in which God speaks into your heart as Jesus is uniquely present in the sacraments. And may it empower you to go forth and do as Christ calls us to do, so that together in our being and in our doing, we are following the one who calls each of us by name. Thanks be to God. Amen.